The United States of America has never experienced anything like this in its history. The US Supreme Court has effectively allowed Donald Trump to usurp power and fire people over whom the US president had no authority at all. The US Supreme Court, by a vote of 6-3, expanded the president's power to fire officials, overturning a precedent that had stood for nearly a century. From now on, Donald Trump is allowed to fire and appoint officials of independent agencies that have never been subordinate to Congress, let alone the president. That was the idea of democracy. There had to be those who balanced politics. Now they're gone. Now, after the Supreme Court's decision, this simply doesn't exist in the US anymore. In addition, the US Supreme Court has also made a decision regarding the elections that will take place in November, and this decision also doesn't bode well for the US. At the same time, the Supreme Court of the United States did not allow Donald Trump to simply fire officials from the Federal Reserve System, which also caused a stir in the media, because that's a pretty blatant case of double standards. Let me try to explain in simple terms what's happening right now in US politics in this episode. Because in recent days, the Supreme Court has been making decision after decision on scandalous lawsuits related to Donald Trump. These decisions are dramatically reshaping the US political landscape. And all of this is leading to a total usurpation and concentration of power in the hands of the president. And I'm sure that from what I can see, even Ukrainian and European media have started writing about these Supreme Court decisions, so I decided to explain to you what's really happening. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, please subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and leave any comment you want. Also subscribe to my Telegram channel Pichi News. The link is in the video description along with my social network links. So, let me start with a figurative explanation of how the political system in the United States works. Here's how power is structured in the US. I'll try to explain this using an analogy. Imagine that your house has 3 locks on the front door, and to get into the house you need to unlock all 3 locks. You have the key to the first lock in your pocket. The key to the second lock is with your neighbors who, make sure you don't do anything foolish. They watch to see if you return from the party drunk. And the third key is held by an independent guard, who can't be fired just because you don't like him. But you once hired this guard, and he is the one who protects the house and doesn't even let you harm it. But he simply won't let you into your own house if you come with the intention of harming it. That's basically how American power has been structured for the past 250 years. The President, Congress, and importantly an independent agency hold each other's hands so that no one becomes too powerful. All 3 have their own keys and one cannot do without the other, and to make a decision you need the keys from all 3. The President, Congress, and the independent agency. But on June 29, the US Supreme Court simply knocked the 3rd lock out of the door. Now in this house, the 3rd lock just isn't there anymore. So the 3rd key isn't needed either. And the Supreme Court did this very carefully, using legal language and without any loud scandals, so most people didn't even notice that something truly historic had actually happened. The US Supreme Court allowed Donald Trump to literally fire anyone he wants. This was the decision in the case of Trump versus Slaughter. The Supreme Court, by a vote of 6-3, expanded the president's power to fire officials, overturning a nearly century-old precedent called Humphrey's executor. What does this mean in simple terms? Put simply, in America, there are about 24 so-called independent agencies. These are organizations that were specifically created to operate apart from politics. They regulate, without exaggeration, absolutely every aspect of Americans' lives. These agencies regulate vast areas of American life: labor disputes, the rights of federal employees, workplace discrimination, various credit unions, labor unions, and so on. Issues regarding the recall of dangerous products, regulation of food and drugs, investigation of plane crashes, and so on and so on and so on. These independent agencies operate outside politics. Since 1914, the law has protected the heads of these agencies with a simple rule. Members of these commissions can only be dismissed, quote, for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. but not for arguing or disagreeing with the president. No, that's the point. These agencies have nothing to do with politics at all, and that allowed them to work for the benefit of Americans under any administration, no matter who was in power. And now the Supreme Court has buried that rule. It all started back in March 2025. Back then, Donald Trump just went ahead and fired a member of the Federal Trade Commission, Rebecca Slaughter, without giving any real reason. He simply said that her tenure was, quote, incompatible with the priorities of the president's administration. And that's it. So, why did he fire her? Because she wasn't a good fit. Period. And Slaughter, of course, filed a lawsuit. The lower courts reinstated her, citing a precedent from 1935. In the end, the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, from the Supreme Court said that all this precedent stuff is nonsense, and so the Supreme Court simply overturns this precedent. And the logic is this: the Federal Trade Commission is not just some independent body. No, it's part of the executive branch. And that means this body should be controlled by the head of the executive branch, that is, the president. And this story wouldn't have gained such momentum if it weren't for one thing. You'd think, well, listen, Donald Trump fired some employee from some commission, so what? Here's what. These agencies were made independent on purpose, even from the head of the executive branch, so that decisions are made based on facts, not on the political will of one person or anyone's political preferences. Slaughter herself explained it this way: independence allows decisions to be made on the merits, based on facts, and for the protection of Americans' interests. When a leader can be fired simply because the president personally doesn't like him, it means that the leader will start acting not in the interests of Americans, but out of loyalty to that president. And the most troubling thing here is that this isn't just an isolated decision. It's not just the firing of one person. It's a change in the very philosophy of power. Lawyers are now calling the doctrine that the court legalized today unitary executive theory. That's the definition. So American lawyers are saying, after this decision, it's the theory of the unitary executive. It's the idea that the president should have complete control over the entire executive branch. So, the entire executive branch can't be independent in any way. It all has to be strictly under the president. And Justice Sotomayor, who spoke out against such a decision, stated that this decision, quote, gives the president power unknown even to the English crown, against which the founding fathers rebelled, elevating him above the branches of government that were once his equals, and turning the duty to faithfully execute the laws into a license to act against those very same laws. And today, as she says, the court is casting aside the democratic system for the sake of someone who twists the structure of government to fit the majority's theory of total unitary executive control. And here is Donald Trump himself, showed how eagerly he awaited this decision. Next is his quote: 90 years of precedent have been completely and unconditionally overturned, which significantly expands presidential power at a time when it is needed most. That is, Donald Trump does not deny that this decision simply expands the powers of the president, and this is called a usurpation of power. But there is a detail in the court's decision that makes the whole picture even more interesting. On the same day, the same Supreme Court considered Donald Trump's attempt to fire Lisa Cook from the Federal Reserve System. This is the central bank of the United States of America, which manages interest rates and essentially holds the country's economy in its hands. It would seem that, based on the previous Supreme Court decision, Trump can just fire her like that. Well, that's it. The court decided that he can fire people. She is no different from the previous employee. But then suddenly the Supreme Court changed its mind, and it blocked Trump's dismissal of Federal Reserve Board member Lisa Cook, preserving the independence of the central bank. Moreover, the decision on the Federal Reserve was made by a margin of 1 vote, 5 judges against 4. And it's strange, why is it allowed when it comes to the bank, but not the Trade Commission? How does that work? In one independent agency, Trump can fire the heads and employees, but in another exactly the same agency, legally, he can't. There's no logic here, and critics notice this right away. So does it mean that all the arguments of the judges in the previous decision are complete, utter nonsense? Is it a complete sham? Why can Trump fire employees in other agencies, but not in the Federal Reserve? That means the only protection left for independent agencies is not the law. In fact, it's up to the mood of 6 judges who can now decide yes or no, regardless of the law. Today, let's say, they spared the Federal Reserve, the Fed, but tomorrow they might change their minds and say, listen, no, let's go ahead and fire Liza Cook after all. That's how the US Supreme Court works now. But the Supreme Court's decision on June 29 is the finale of a long series in which power was gradually concentrated in one set of hands, step by step. To show the scale, I'll break down the timeline. The first step was during President Trump's first term. That's when the Supreme Court already started to undermine the protection of independent agencies, allowing Trump to fire the head of another agency, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And at that time, the court carefully said that it's allowed to fire them because it's led by a single director, not a board. What they meant was, if an agency is led by one person and not a board, then, well, you can fire that one person. But today, that exception was dropped, and now it's possible to fire members of multi-member commissions as well. And the second step is the question of immunity. I don't know, maybe many have already forgotten about this, but in 2024, the same Supreme Court, for the first time in 250 years, ruled something that changed the president's very standing in relation to the law. At that time, it was decided that if the head of state, that is Donald Trump, takes actions officially, specifically in an official capacity as president, he is protected from criminal prosecution for those actions. Legal or not, it doesn't matter. If he was president, you can't touch him. And that's probably the first time a US president was, elevated above the law. They said, well, the law is supposed to be equal for everyone, but some are more equal than others. So if the president breaks the law, but he's the president basically, you can't touch him. And the third step is nationwide injunctions. And in 2025, Trump's second term had already begun, and then the court limited the judge's right to block White House actions across the country. And once again, by a vote of 6-3, the Supreme Court narrowed the scope of nationwide injunctions so that they only applied to those who directly filed the lawsuit. Hypothetically, an illegal act is committed against a group, and in this group of people, only one person went and filed a lawsuit. The court recognizes that illegal actions were taken against the entire group of people, but it only protects the one person who filed the lawsuit. As for the rest, if you want, you can file as well. That's how it worked. In plain language, previously one judge could stop an illegal order for all Americans at once. That was possible. Now it's only for individual plaintiffs, and the rest will have to sue separately. That's it. A single judge can no longer simply block some of Trump's decisions from taking effect. And here's the most important point that people often miss. Usurpation of power happens not only by seizing authority, but also by removing those who can say no, an official no. And today's decision on dismissals and last year's decision on court injunctions are 2 strikes at the same target, to remove independent people capable of stopping the President of the United States. First, they weaken the judges. A single judge, cannot make a decision in the interest of the entire American people. It's not allowed. And now they're weakening independent agencies that were supposed to operate outside politics and free from political ideology. But fortunately for now, there is also another side to this. The court doesn't always rubber stamp rulings in Trump's favor. To be fair and accurate, it's important to show where Trump loses as well. Trump suffered a major defeat on trade tariffs. And let me remind you, on February 20, 2026, the Supreme Court, by a vote of 6-3, overturned Trump's sweeping global tariffs, ruling that the president had overstepped his authority by invoking the Emergency Powers Act. Trump was furious at the time, called the decision shameful, and said he was ashamed of such judges. By the way, it's interesting. Now he's not ashamed of these judges. Back then he was ashamed and said, the judges are bad, but now the judges are good. And on June 29, there was another unexpected event that hit Trump. The court upheld state laws that allow mail-in ballots received after Election Day to be counted. And this was an unexpected rebuff to Trump's long-standing tactic against mail-in voting. Trump immediately called on the US Congress to pass the Save America Act, which would restrict mail-in ballots and introduce strict new requirements for identification and proof of citizenship. And the court also rejected his appeal in the Jean Carroll case. This means that Trump must pay the former columnist $5 million. I'll briefly explain what happened here. Writer and journalist Jean Carroll publicly stated that in the mid-1990s, Donald Trump sexually assaulted her in a department store fitting room in New York. Trump, of course, categorically denied these accusations, called Carroll a liar, and said her story was a fabricated scam. In response, the journalist filed civil lawsuits against Trump for defamation and damage to her reputation. As a result, the court found him legally responsible for sexual abuse and defamation, although the actual fact of rape was considered unproven by New York's criminal standards. Nevertheless, they found him liable and now he has to pay $5 million, but let's get back to the elections. On June 29, the court took a step that will have repercussions for many years to come. The Supreme Court agreed to review the legality of mass voter list purges in the final weeks before the elections, as part of a larger case about the methods Arizona uses to remove non-citizens from the rolls, and it explicitly states the context in which this is happening. This strengthens Republican efforts to tighten voting rules amid Donald Trump's unfounded claims of widespread fraud. Why is all this dangerous? Well, first, the Supreme Court, by allowing Trump to fire the heads of independent agencies, destroyed the safeguard, the very guard at the front door. The system with 3 branches of government doesn't exist out of some great love for bureaucracy, but because unchecked power always ends the same way, with abuse and usurpation. Always. When the president can fire any regulator, investigator, or arbiter who simply gets in his way, the very meaning of independent oversight disappears. And in Ukraine, they tried to do just that, like they tried with the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office. Thank God it didn't work out. An agency that is supposed to check, for example, the safety of medicines and food, that should investigate plane crashes, protect consumers, protect workers, and so on, now starts looking to the White House instead of the facts and starts checking. So, what's the mood over there right now? If Trump, for example, asks for action, hypothetically say, against workers, then this agency won't protect them. Because the head of this agency understands that if he goes against Trump's will, he'll be fired immediately. That's it. So, the focus isn't on facts, but on political circumstances. Second, this works for any future president. And it's critically important to understand this outside of partisan politics. The power that the Supreme Court handed to Donald Trump today will remain with the next occupant of the White House, whoever that may be. That's why even some Republicans were shocked by this decision, because they understand perfectly well that all these powers will remain with the next Democratic president too. And, this is the third thing. If you look at all these decisions separately, they don't seem that scary. Well, someone got fired. They fired some official, they restricted judges in some states, they just weakened one law, that's all. They agreed to consider only one case, so individually, all of this seems like little things, it's nothing. But the point is, if you look at all this from the outside, it becomes obvious. More and more power is flowing to one person, and fewer people remain who can say stop. And perhaps the most telling detail is the background against which all this is happening. A recent poll showed that Americans' pride in their democracy has dropped to 28%. Less than a third of Americans today are proud of how their democracy works. Less than a third. The country that rose up against a king 250 years ago is now celebrating its anniversary by debating whether its president has gained powers unknown even to that very crown. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.